Hello, my name is Leo Hicker with the ATM101 Unit 14 screencast from Wiseman, Alaska. I'm reporting on a week of weather for both Bethel and Capark based off the National Weather Service observations from February 1st through 10th, 2019 and March 15th through 24th, 2019. Starting with Bethel on the left side of the page, the National Weather Service temperature is reported as the red line with the climate average as the black line with the white squares here in the middle, and the dashed line on either side of it being the climate average minimum and maximum for that time. During the week of February 1st through 10th, the weather started on the 1st actually directly at the average temperature, then climbed throughout the rest of the, or into the second day and stayed way above average for the rest of the week, dipping back down toward average at the end of the week, but not actually getting back into the range of average. For February 1st, the average temperature was 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with the minimum and maximum being 10 degrees Fahrenheit and 29 degrees Fahrenheit, respectively. I put that as somewhat higher than average. Average being 9 degrees with a range of 15 Fahrenheit and 3 degrees Fahrenheit. I put it somewhat higher as it started in the range, and then its average remained about, within twice the range of the climate minimum and maximum. So I put that as somewhat higher than the climate average of 9 degrees. For February 8th, Friday, the minimum and maximum temperatures reported by the National Weather Service were 26 degrees for the minimum and 34 degrees Fahrenheit for the maximum, with an average of 30. This is way higher than the climate average of 9 degrees. So it's considerably warmer than the average temperature for that time. Throughout this week, there's not really any noticeable diurnal cycle from solar heating throughout the day. There's a slight spike toward the end of Monday in temperature, but there's not really a consistent spikes in temperature toward the end of any of the days across the board. Moving on to Bethel's pressure, the green line here represents the National Weather Service observations. There was a variation of over 30 millibars throughout the week, with a high up here of just over 1,030 and a low of just under 1,000. But there's not really a very large correlation between the pressure and the temperature. There's a slight dip in temperature where there's this massive spike in pressure, and then as the temperature drops off, the pressure climbs again back here at the end of the week, Saturday and Sunday. But overall, there's not a whole lot of correlation between the pressure and the temperature there. Moving down to our dew point and relative humidity. The dew point is shown as the blue line here, and the relative humidity as the gray dashed line. There was a substantial change in dew point over the week, about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And it mirrors the curve of the temperature very well, is almost an exact copy of it, which has to do with that the average relative humidity is pretty stable, and thus just with warmer temperatures there's a higher dew point, and vice versa. For Capark on the right side of the page here for the February 1st through 10th, the first couple days of the week started with relatively average temperatures, where after that it climbed again, like Bethel did, way above average toward the end of the week. It actually dipped into the range of the climate min-maxes there on Wednesday, but overall stayed well above the climatology averages. On February 1st, the minimum was negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the maximum was negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit, with an average of negative 17. Which is right along with the climate average of negative 18 Fahrenheit. So the first couple days here, very well within the climate average. However, on the 8th of February, which is this Friday, the temperatures had a minimum and maximum of 21 degrees for the minimum and 32 degrees for the maximum, with an average of 27, which is much, much higher than the average, the climate average of negative 19 Fahrenheit. Again, like in Bethel, there's not really much noticeable diurnal cycle going on yet. This side especially is too far north, and the sun is just very low in the sky at these times. It has very little power. For Kapark's pressure, it again had pretty substantial changes throughout the week of, again, about 30 millibars, same as Bethel. It has a bit better relationship to the temperature, with the spikes in pressure actually accompanying spikes in temperature, except the beginning of the week here where the pressure was just falling, which I think had to do with as a system moved in that brought these warmer temperatures to Kapark. Was here as the pressure fell as the system moved in at the beginning of the week. Moving on to the dew point and relative humidity, the dew point saw a change of about approximately 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a massive change in dew point over a week. It went from below 30 below all the way up to above 30 above. It's a massive change. And the dew point mirrors the temperature very well, with higher temperatures meaning a higher dew point. The relative humidity stayed pretty high throughout the week. Was a little lower at the beginning with the lower temperatures, and then as what appears to be a warm, moist air mass moved in, it stabilized relatively high. Both Bethel and Kapark this week averaged well above climatology average temperatures for that time. For Bethel in March, the first half of the week of the 15th through 24th of March was relatively average temperature-wise, with spikes going above and below the climate average, but the average temperatures being pretty close to the climate average temperature. Then at the end of the week, we see a large departure, going well above climate average temperatures again. The first day we'll look at is March 18th, the Monday, with the maximum temperature being 22 degrees Fahrenheit and the minimum temperature being 11 Fahrenheit, with a range of 17 Fahrenheit. This is right about the average of the climate average of 16 degrees Fahrenheit. And even the spikes from that day are within the climate min-max temperatures. The second day we'll look at is March 22nd, which is this Friday, where temperatures are obviously well above climate average, with the maximum being a 43 and the minimum being 33 for the day. That average of 38 is well above the climate average of 17 for that day. We're starting to see a pretty distinctive diurnal cycle here, with mornings starting colder and late afternoons being the hottest part of each day in the period, actually. There was a pressure variation of about 20 millibars over the week, which is still a notable variation in pressure. It does a pretty good job of explaining some of the temperature changes, where we can see a relatively mirrored image of the temperature curve, with spikes in pressure relating to low temperature. Higher pressure usually is associated with clear air and thus more radiative cooling and colder nights and days, while the dips in pressure account for cloudier days, which also account for warmer days. As far as dew point and relative humidity, it was a pretty decent range, over 35 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty big change in dew point over the week. The dew point follows the same trends as temperature, which is to be expected. The relative humidity shows a pretty serious diurnal cycle here, with the highest relative humidities being toward the morning And then as it heats up at the end of the day, assuming a relatively constant dew point, the relative humidity drops at the end of the day as the temperature goes up. Overall, throughout the week, the relative humidity averages to a pretty constant value. For Kapark in March, the temperature started above average, not crazy above average, just a little above average, and then dropping into almost the realm of the average by Wednesday and Thursday before departing the average for the warm side again toward the end of the week. On the 18th of March, the temperature peaked, almost the week's peak actually. The Sunday got a little warmer, but it's still a notable peak of the high of 22 and a low of 4, with an average of 13 degrees Fahrenheit, which that average is well above the climate average of negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit. For March 22nd, the Friday, the temperature started right at average in the morning, actually, but then toward the end of the day climbed well above average, with the low temperature that morning being actually the lowest of the week at negative 15 Fahrenheit, and the high being 8 degrees Fahrenheit, an average of negative 4, which is somewhat close to the climate average of negative 13. The climate max for that day is negative 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is well below the day's maximum of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, but not by a huge amount. So I would put that at somewhat warmer than average. There's not much in the way of a diurnal cycle this far north yet. Really none to be observed. Throughout the week in Kapark, there's approximately a 30-degree difference between the minimum and maximum pressure, which is a notable value. The pressure shows pretty good correlation to the temperature, with again low pressures corresponding to warm temperatures and high pressures corresponding to low temperatures. The dew point is a almost perfect match to the temperature curve, partly to do with that the relative humidity overall throughout the week stayed relatively constant, so any increase in temperature thus meant it had to also accompany a increased dew point. Some general notes on the climates of both Kapark up here in the north and Bethel down here in the southwest. Kapark is much further north than Bethel, and thus will be generally colder. Both Kapark and Bethel are coastal locations, at low altitude, relatively close to the ocean. Both have some mountains inland of them a little ways that will affect some of the weather patterns they're receiving. Both of their weathers are highly dependent on local weather patterns and wind flows. For example, here in this slide, Kapark has a wind coming in from interior Alaska, which means it's going to be getting a relatively dry air mass moving in, relatively dry and cold as that air has moved over the interior of Alaska here in the winter. Especially with the Brooks Range being south of Kapark here, as that air moves up over the mountains, it will be very dry by the time it gets to Kapark. The exact opposite is highlighted in Bethel at the moment in this slide, with this large low pressure bringing moist, relatively warm air off the ocean onshore at Bethel before it hits the mountains. This will result in relatively cloudy weather in Bethel. For the week in February, we look at two slides, February 1st and February 8th, and we see that for Bethel, throughout both of them, there is generally a low pressure out over the ocean here in the southwest corner of the map that's bringing warm, moist air from over the ocean onto the west coast of Alaska, and thus Bethel, with a southwest wind. This brings humid air and makes for a relatively warm week overall, as it's really getting air from quite a ways south of Alaska, bringing it up over relatively warm ocean waters before it reaches the coast. For Kapark over the same week, at the beginning of the week here, Kapark is getting air from the interior region of Alaska and western Canada as the air circulates around this high pressure here to the east of Kapark. This helps account for the colder start we observed for that week of weather in Kapark. And then by the end of the week, Kapark is being dominated by this low pressure sitting off the coast. And then by the end of the week, Kapark is receiving moisture primarily from this large low just south of Siberia, which is again bringing warm, humid air up from over the ocean, up over the Bering Strait, all the way to Kapark. This is making for relatively warm conditions in Kapark. At the beginning of the week in March for Bethel, Bethel is receiving wind that is coming off the Gulf of Alaska, but after moving up through the mountains, really it's getting interior air, which is a cooler air mass, which helps account for the slightly cooler temperatures we saw at the beginning of that week, or more average temperatures we saw at the beginning of the week for Bethel. Then by the end of the week, on Friday, the 22nd of March, this low has moved, and now Kapark is really getting air pretty well directly from over the Gulf. It hasn't crossed much in the way of mountains before it gets there, and Bethel's getting that warmer air from over the ocean again. As far as Kapark is concerned, at the beginning of the week, it's getting relatively warm air again from the southwest here, as it spins off this large low down over the ocean, kind of rides up beside this low just south of Siberia, catches a bit of a ride off this high, staying most of the time over ocean before hitting Kapark, where throughout the week was relatively warm temperatures. At the end of the week, there's just one primary low sitting kind of over the Aleutians here, pushing warm air up all the way to Kapark again. Looking at some satellite images for March, at the beginning of the week, we're seeing thinner clouds across both sites in both the visible and the infrared spectrum, with just pretty gray, thin clouds shown at both sites. Kapark in the north and Bethel in the south. Not a huge amount of water vapor in either location, but there is definitely some kicking around. By the end of the week, both locations are starting to show some thicker clouds. Here in the visible, we can see it as the lighter gray patches, and in the infrared, one can really see the higher cloud tops as the lighter, almost white portions of the map shown over Kapark and down here over Bethel. It's indicating thicker clouds, which acts as more of an insulation blanket, and is keeping both sites pretty warm at the end of the week. Water vapors, increased water vapor content, especially up by Kapark, is showing lots of water vapor in the air. Overall, throughout the week, the main changes in temperature, dew point, and relative humidity were caused by air mass exchange. There was some daily variation present, mainly in the relative humidity and dew point, but it's also temperature. This happened primarily in March, as the sun was higher in the sky, higher solar angle, and more energy being received from the sun, having more of an effect on the diurnal cycle. But the primary changes in weather and the departures from climate average were caused by air mass exchange. Throughout February here in the middle slide, and March on the right slide of this 300 millibar upper air chart, you can see a pretty prominent ridge developed here in March over Alaska and Canada and the United States. And in February, it's a little bit more to the west. Hasn't rotated up yet, down over the ocean. But in both cases, it's kind of bringing warm ocean air up toward Alaska, and definitely helped account for the warmer temperatures. The jet stream associated with that change between that ridge and the trough around it, and the polar front, definitely helped lead to some cyclone development and strengthening of already developed cyclones, which definitely helped increase the levels of cloudiness and thus led to warmer temperatures. A more average year, as is seen in 2012 here in these slides, where we don't have that strong ridge pushing up into Alaska, leaving the jet stream a bit further south, we wouldn't have nearly as much of that cyclonic development in Alaska as we saw in 2019 here in February and March. And that would bring us a little closer back to the average temperatures. Now, overall, as far as the sensitivity to climate change, Kapark is more sensitive to climate change because of simply being further north, where it is affected more by polar amplification, and also largely affected by the presence of snow and ice. As the polar ice cap melts and reduces the albedo of the ocean, where it'll start absorbing more sunlight, Kapark is going to see large increases in temperature. As well as with those increases in temperature, there will be less snow and ice surrounding the tundra around Kapark, and thus it will be a lot warmer as well. Bethel, on the other hand, is usually near the open ocean year-round, and thus a melt in sea ice or polar ice cap won't have nearly as large of an effect as Bethel, as it is kind of regulated by the ocean waters nearby. Change in weather patterns would have a very large effect on Kapark, a lot more so than on Bethel. Primarily, Kapark's weather is dominated by a high over the Arctic Ocean, where it gets cold Arctic air coming down from the north, regulating its weather. If we see a shift, as we did a lot this year, with Kapark's weather being dominated by lows down over the ocean, bringing warm, moist air, it'll have huge effects on Kapark's weather, with a lot cloudier and a lot warmer weather than one might expect from a climate average. This will have less of an effect on Bethel, as Bethel already primarily gets its weather off the ocean there and makes for a relatively maritime climate. Thank you for watching.